roar of engines shattered the quiet Texas morning, heralding trouble long before it arrived. In the small, peaceful town of Oakridge, no one asked questions about Mike Turner's past. To the townsfolk, he was just Big Mike, the steady-handed mechanic with tired eyes, a man who preferred fixing engines over remembering the echoes of war. But when a gang of bikers crosses into town, demanding what isn't theirs, Mike realizes the peace he fought so hard for is about to be ripped away. They think he's just an old mechanic. They think they can intimidate him, but they have no idea who he really is or what he's done to survive. When the dust settles, only one side will be left standing. And Mike Turner isn't about to lose his home. The war has followed him to Oakridge. But this time, he's not fighting for a flag or a faceless mission. He's fighting for the only place that ever mattered. And when the battle begins, these men will regret choosing the wrong enemy. Before we continue this amazing story written for you, let's take a quick pause. Have you subscribed to our channel here on YouTube? If not, consider subscribing. Tomorrow we have an even more thrilling story lined up, and you'll only get the notification if you click subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, let's get back to it. The small town of Redstone was a place that seemed to have been forgotten by time. A main road cut through the village in two directions, lined with simple establishments that served mainly travelers and truck drivers passing by. At the center of it all was Iron Haven, the region's oldest and most trusted repair shop. It was a sturdy concrete space, with paint peeling at the edges and a neon sign blinking somewhat stubbornly. Behind the counter, surrounded by tools arranged with military precision, stood Raymond Ray Carter. At 63, Ray was a man of few words and a quiet gaze, but his physique still showed signs of a disciplined past. His strong arms, bulging with veins, looked as if they had been shaped for hard work. His face was marked by subtle scars and lines that told stories he rarely shared. For those who didn't know his story, Ray was simply an exceptional mechanic, the kind of man who could fix an engine with the precision of a surgeon and make every screw look like a vital part of a cog. He didn't tolerate mistakes. His motto was simple: if you're going to do it right, or don't do it at all. What the townspeople knew was that Ray kept to himself. His routine began early, with the smell of strong coffee filling the pre-dawn workshop line, followed by the steady sound of engines and tools. In the eyes of the community, he was a rock, a reliable man who could be counted on for urgent repairs and quick conversations about anything but his past. The usual peace of Redstone was shattered when the low rumble of engines filled the town on a clear Wednesday morning. The sound was loud enough to make the windows in the shop vibrate slightly. Ray was leaning over a truck engine, adjusting a piston when he heard the bikes approaching. He didn't look up right away. There was something about the noise he recognized, a kind of arrogance in the volume of the revs that he had learned to recognize in another life. The motorcycles parked in front of the workshop with a squeal of brakes. There were three men, dressed in worn leather jackets, each with an emblem on the back, a skull with metallic wings, flanked by two crossed chains. The name Iron Vultures was emblazoned in thick letters. Ray sighed. He stood up slowly, wiping his hands on a grease-stained cotton cloth. Young Jack, his 20-something apprentice, watched everything from a corner, with a wrench in his hands and a suspicious look. "Stay where you are," Ray said calmly, without taking his eyes off the truck. Jack nodded, although his body was tense. One of the bikers, the largest of the three, stepped forward. He had a long, unkempt beard, round sunglasses, and tattoos that ran up his neck. He stopped just inside the garage entrance, blocking the way with his arms crossed. "So, old man, are you the owner of this place?" he asked, his voice drawn out and full of contempt. They glared at him but remained calm. "I am." "Is there a problem?" he asked, dryly. The biker smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "We just want to know if you're paying for the right to work here," he said, taking a toothpick from his mouth and throwing it on the ground. "It's our road, you know, and our people need to make sure everything keeps working." Ray wiped a last smudge of oil from his arm and finally stepped forward. positioning himself next to Jack. His gaze was calm, but intense. "There's no room for that here. Do you want something fixed? I'll do the job. Other than that, go on your way," Ray replied, each word spoken firmly. The two other bikers laughed, while the leader narrowed his eyes behind his glasses. "Old man, you don't understand. We're not asking. We're giving you a chance to cooperate. Before things get ugly." Ray gave a faint smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, a cold, calculated smile. He took a step toward the leader, closing the distance between them. Even though he wasn't much taller, Ray had a presence that seemed to grow in space. "I'll say it again. I'm not interested." The silence that followed was thick as a storm about to break out. The leader of the bikers, Nate, as the emblem embroidered on his chest said, stared at Ray for a long moment before laughing and slamming his hands on the side of the iron door. "It's okay, Grandpa. We'll come back. And we'll settle this the right way." Nate turned around and climbed onto his bike, followed by the other two. The roar of engines filled the street again as the three disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving the city with an eerie silence in the air. Jack finally let out his breath, as if he had been holding it the whole time. "Ray, who are these guys?" Ray picked up his coffee mug and took a long sip before answering. "Problems." Jack looked in the direction where the bikers had left. "They'll come back, won't they?" Ray set the mug down with a soft clink and looked at Jack seriously. "Yes. And when they come back, they won't want to talk." Jack hesitated for a moment before asking, "What are we going to do?" Ray wiped a drop of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and gave a small smile that mixed tiredness and determination. "We're going to keep working." Jack didn't look completely convinced, but he nodded. He knew there was more to that answer than Ray was willing to explain. The old mechanic went back to his work, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. Something inside him had been reactivated, an ancient instinct he had kept buried for years. He was no mere mechanic, and if the Iron Vultures thought he was just an ordinary man, they would soon learn that they had chosen the wrong target. The end of the afternoon in Redstone arrived with a silence that seemed to foreshadow something inevitable. The heat of the sun had diminished, but in the Iron Haven workshop the atmosphere was more tense than ever. Ray continued to work on an old truck, but his movements were slower, almost distracted. His gaze occasionally strayed to the entrance of the workshop, as if he were waiting for something. Jack was outside, cleaning a tire iron, but he couldn't hide his nervousness. The memory of the three bikers still echoed in his head, along with the certainty that they would keep their promise to return. He saw Ray emerge from under the hood, his face serious and his eyes focused. Jack took a deep breath before speaking. "They won't let this go, Ray. I saw the way they looked at you," Jack said, wiping his greasy hands on a grimy rag. Ray picked up a bottle of water from the counter, took a sip and answered without looking at the young man. "They really won't." The calm response only increased Jack's anxiety, who took a step forward, uneasily. "So why don't we do something now? We can go to the sheriff or, I don't know, close the shop for a few days until this blows over." Ray looked up for the first time and studied Jack for a moment before setting the bottle aside. "Close? The shop?" he asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "Is that what you think will solve it?" Jack hesitated, but shrugged. "I mean, it's better than waiting here while they come up with more guys and do whatever they want." Ray let out a sigh and ran a hand through his short, gray hair. He turned and looked out the garage entrance at the deserted road ahead. "Jack, listen," he began, his tone firm but not harsh. "I've seen people like this before. No matter what we do, it won't be enough for them. They don't want real money or respect. They want control. They want to see people afraid. And I'm not going to give that to them." Jack watched him silently, absorbing those words. He didn't know much about Ray's past, but he could sense that those words came from bitter experience. "What if they try to break everything?" "Destroy the workshop," Jack insisted, unable to contain his concern. Ray gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. Tools can be replaced, Jack. People can't. Before Jack could respond, the familiar sound of engines filled the air again. It was low, deep, and each rev seemed like a warning. The iron vultures were back. Jack held his breath and looked at Ray, expecting a different reaction. But the old mechanic simply took off his apron and hung it on a hook on the wall. "Stay inside," Ray said, as he grabbed a clean cloth and slowly wiped his hands. "No matter what happens, you don't interfere." Jack was about to protest, but Ray cut him off with a look that left no room for argument. Outside, 5 bikes pulled up in front of the garage, forming an intimidating line. The leader, Nate, got off first, followed by the other 4 bikers, each wearing leather jackets adorned with the gang's emblem. The setting sun behind them cast long, menacing shadows on the dirt floor. Nate took off his sunglasses and smiled cruelly as he saw Ray standing in the doorway of the workshop. His hands relaxed at his sides. "Look who's here," Nate said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The old mechanic who thinks he can make the rules." Ray didn't answer. He just stood there, watching each of them with disconcerting calm. Nate took a few steps forward, while the others slowly spread out, forming a semicircle. "I tried to be polite before," Nate continued, his tone falsely friendly. "But you don't seem to understand the generosity of our offer. So, I'll make it clear now." He pointed toward the workshop with a sweeping gesture. This is all Iron Vulture territory now. If you want to keep working, you'll have to pay. It's that simple. Otherwise..." Nate gave a short laugh and lifted a foot to kick a bucket of oil, sending the viscous liquid spilling across the floor. Jack, watching from inside, felt his blood boil. Ray stood still, his eyes briefly focused on the other bikers, memorizing their positions. Finally, he took a step forward, causing the group to snap to attention. "I'll say this one. Last time," Ray said, his voice low but firm, "I'm not paying you. I'm not bowing down. And if you think you can scare me..." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. They chose the wrong place. Nate's laughter slowly died away, turning into a cold, angry glare. He stepped closer, standing just inches away from Ray. "Are you sure about that, old man?" The air seemed to have grown thicker. Jack watched, his heart racing, as Ray stared into Nate's eyes, unblinking. "Absolutely." For a second, there was complete silence. The other bikers seemed to be waiting for a signal, ready to act. Nate clenched his fists, and for a moment, Jack was sure he was going to attack. But then the Vulture leader smiled again, though his eyes remained filled with anger. "Okay," Nate muttered, putting his glasses back on. "We're leaving for now." He turned to the others and nodded. "But don't get used to the calm," he said before getting on the bike. "Next time, we won't chat." The engines roared again, and the group sped off, kicking up dust on the road as they disappeared around the bend. Jack ran out into the driveway as soon as they pulled away. "Ray, they're coming back, and you know it. We can't just wait." Ray looked into the distance with a distant gaze, as if he saw something far beyond the road. "I know you'll come back," he replied, turning slowly to Jack. "And that's exactly what I want." Jack was speechless. The old mechanic wasn't just expecting a confrontation. He was preparing for a war. The sun rose over Redstone like any other day, but the sense of normalcy was elusive. The air felt heavier, and anyone familiar with the city's daily life knew something was about to happen. In the Iron Haven workshop, Ray was going about his usual routine, adjusting gears with precision while freshly brewed coffee sat in his old, chipped mug. But Jack knew that behind that serene expression, something bigger was unfolding. "You didn't even sleep, did you?" Jack asked, watching Ray tighten a screw harder than necessary. Ray didn't respond immediately, He finished adjusting, wiped his hands with a cloth, and finally turned around. "I didn't have time for that," he replied, shrugging. "It's their next move, and I want to be ready." Jack crossed his arms, visibly frustrated. "Ready? Ray, there are so many of them. 5, 10, maybe 20. We can't do this alone." Her voice was shaking, but not just tough. From fear, it was genuine concern. Ray gave a slight smile. "I never said we were going to do this alone." Jack blinked in confusion as Ray walked over to the old table at the back of the workshop, where there was a toolbox with an old cell phone. On top of it, he picked up the phone, a simple model, far from modern. Without ceremony, he punched in a few numbers. Jack watched, not knowing what to expect. "Ray, what are you doing?" he asked cautiously, calling for reinforcements. On the other end of the line, a voice answered almost immediately. "This is Ray." He paused and looked at Jack before continuing. "I need a favor." Jack saw a subtle change in Ray. His normally calm tone was firmer, almost military. It was as if he were stepping back into a role he had long since left behind. The morning passed quietly. Ray kept busy organizing the shop and reinforcing small areas that looked vulnerable. He welded a steel plate to the bottom of the front door, installed reinforced hinges, and repositioned the shelves so they could act as makeshift barricades if needed. Jack watched him silently, increasingly convinced that Ray knew much more. Then he led on. "Who were those people you called?" Jack finally asked. Ray finished tightening one last screw and wiped the sweat from his forehead before answering. "People who know what to do when things get out of hand. People I trust." Jack was silent for a moment, but the distant sound of engines coming from the road made him jump. He ran to the entrance of the workshop and looked toward the horizon. "I think they're coming back," he shouted, his heart racing. Ray approached calmly, the sound of the engines growing louder. But when Jack saw who was approaching, his expression of fear gave way to surprise. It wasn't the Iron Vultures. It was 3 pickup trucks and 4 motorcycles, each driven by men in different leather jackets. They didn't have gang emblems. They had something much more subtle, experienced looks and organized demeanors. The trucks pulled up, and the men got out, nodding to Ray. The first to approach was a tall, stocky man with graying hair and a thin scar along his jaw. "Captain Carter, it's been a while," he said with a slight smile. Ray reached out and shook his hand. "You can call me Ray Davidson. I stopped being captain a long time ago." Jack watched without understanding. "Who are you?" he asked, still not believing the scene. Davidson looked at Ray before answering, as if asking permission. "Old friends. We've worked with Ray on situations similar to this." "Military?" Jack asked, already knowing the answer. Ray just nodded. "Let's just say we did a lot of things together that never made the headlines." The men began unloading supplies from the trucks. Iron bars, metal sheets, and other items indicated they were there to reinforce the defense of the place, not to attack. Jack was speechless at how quickly and accurately they worked. Ray turned to Jack. "The plan isn't to start a war," he explained. "The plan is to show them that this place can't be taken. They'll realize that before everything falls apart for them." Jack still had 1,000 questions, but the look in Ray's eyes said that the most important thing was to keep moving. The rest of the day was spent preparing. Davidson and the others reinforced the walls with steel. Plates created an escape route at the rear and installed cameras that covered the most critical angles. It was all done discreetly and efficiently. As night began to fall, Ray gathered everyone in the center of the workshop. Jack was among them, feeling small in front of so many experienced men. "They'll come at you with everything," Ray began, his tone calm but firm. "What they want isn't just money, it's control, but what they don't understand is that control isn't gained through violence, it's gained through respect. And today, we're going to show them that." The men nodded, some smiling with that quiet confidence that only war veterans seem to have. Jack felt a stab of fear, but also something new, a glimmer of confidence. Davidson walked over to him and lightly tapped him on the shoulder. You'll be fine, kid. You're with the best team possible." Jack took a deep breath and nodded, even though he wasn't sure how this would end. As darkness settled over Redstone, the silence was once again shattered by the deafening sound of dozens of motorcycles. The Iron Vultures were coming in force, and this time there were no smiles or taunts. They came with one intention: destruction. But inside Iron Haven, Ray and his team waited calmly, prepared to prove that this battle would not be as easy as the Vultures thought. The storm was about to begin. The sound of the motorcycles approached like a steady thunder, reverberating off the reinforced walls of the Iron Haven workshop. Jack peered through the crack in one of the newly barricaded windows and saw the glare of their headlights cutting through the darkness. They weren't trying to intimidate anymore. They were coming at them with a vengeance. There were at least 20 motorcycles in a chaotic line, and behind them, a black pickup truck with rusted sides carried more men armed with iron bars and chains. Ray approached calmly and peered over Jack's shoulder. "They brought reinforcements." "Just as I expected," he murmured, his tone almost indifferent. Davidson checked a portable radio while other men set up barricades and maintained a visual perimeter. Jack looked at Ray in disbelief. "That looks like an army, Ray. How are we going to hold off that many?" Ray placed his hand on Jack's shoulder, firm but not aggressive. "We don't win with brute force, Jack. We win with intelligence. They think they can surround us and crush us, but they are predictable, and predictability is weakness." Outside, Nate, his vest slick with oil and the Iron Vulture's emblem gleaming on his chest, slunk off his bike with heavy, angry strides. He shouted hoarsely and impatiently, his voice carrying across the empty street. "Ray Carter, you think you can play Fortress? You think your friends will protect you? This is our territory now." He waved his hand, and more bikes advanced, forming a semicircle around the workshop. "Get out now, and I might just break your legs." Ray smiled slightly and exchanged a glance with Davidson. He opened the side door no more than a few inches and walked out alone to the front of the shop, walking as calmly as ever, as if he were going to buy bread. Jack held his breath, fearing this was a suicidal move. But Ray knew what he was doing. "Here I am, Nate." "Ray," said Dare, his voice clear. "And I see you brought the whole town with you." Nate laughed, but his eyes still held that pent-up anger. "It's better this way, old man. There's nowhere to run. This time, we're going to go in there and destroy everything. It'll be as if this workshop never existed." Ray crossed his arms. "And that's your grand plan? Thinking that intimidating with numbers will solve anything? No wonder you need to follow someone like Ramirez to get anything done." The name Ramirez dropped like a bomb. Nate stepped forward, his smile fading. "Don't meddle where you're not called, old man." "I'm already in this," Ray interrupted. "And I'll give you some advice that might save your skin. Turn around now, before you and yours end up buried in the same hole that the Ramirez cartel is digging." Nate hesitated. As arrogant as he was, something about Ray's posture made him uncomfortable. But soon his pride got the better of him, and he shouted an order. "Break everything!" The Vultures charged forward, running towards the workshop with war cries and makeshift weapons in hand. They didn't know they were walking into a carefully laid trap. Davidson, positioned inside the workshop, gave the signal to the other veterans. "Phase 1!" he shouted. Jack watched wide-eyed as Ray's traps sprang into action. A camouflaged tripwire sprang into action, knocking 2 of the fastest bikers off their feet. They fell with a crash, screaming in pain as they hit the ground. Meanwhile, Davidson and 2 other men emerged from the side and, with almost choreographed precision, threw makeshift smoke bombs that exploded with a muffled sound, sending a thick haze into the air. Within the smokescreen, the Vultures' screams grew more desperate. They couldn't see anything, Ray advanced swiftly and, before one of the bikers could react, knocked him down with a precise blow to the knee, followed by a punch straight to the jaw. Jack, who was watching everything through a small opening in the side door, could not believe his eyes. Ray was not only skilled, he was fast, methodical. Every move was calculated, with no wasted energy. Nate emerged from the smoke, his eyes wide with fury. He held a chain and swung it hard, making a menacing hum in the air. He charged toward Ray, roaring like an animal. "Do you think this will save you?" he shouted, throwing the chain at Ray. Ray dodged with surprising ease for someone his age, and in one fluid motion, he grabbed the chain as it passed him. With a quick yank, he unhinged Nate and sent him stumbling forward. In an instant, Ray shouldered into him, knocking him backward with a crash. Nate lay on the ground, panting, as Ray slowly approached. "This isn't about strength, Nate. It's about intelligence, and you don't have any." Before Nate could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police cars and federal vehicles appeared at both ends of the road. They weren't there by coincidence. Ray knew the final siege needed to be flawless. He had coordinated the arrival of the authorities with precision, using every minute to set the stage. The iron vultures froze when they heard the sirens. Some tried to flee, but the exits were blocked. The police and federal agents descended with guns drawn, surrounding the remaining bikers. Nate looked at Ray with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "You set all this up," he muttered. Ray knelt down beside him and spoke softly, just so he could hear. "I warned you. You picked the wrong target." Nate was handcuffed by one of the officers while shouting insults. The other bikers were taken down one by one without a chance to react. Jack slowly left the workshop, still trying to assimilate everything that had happened. Davidson walked past him and gave him a light pat on the back. "Not bad for an old mechanic, huh?" he said with a smile. Jack looked at Ray, who was standing silently, watching everything unfold with an expression that was a mixture of relief and tiredness. "Ray," Jack began, not knowing how to continue. "How did you know it would work?" Ray looked at Jack, and after a few seconds, he responded with a slight smile. "Because some battles aren't won with luck, Jack. They're won with preparation and a little stubbornness." Jack smiled back. For the first time, he completely understood. The workshop was safe, and the lesson had been taught. No one would dare mess with Ironhaven again. The sirens faded as the police continued to subdue the last members of the Iron Vultures. The air was still thick with the smell of smoke and dust, but the picture was clear. The attack had failed, and the gang was destroyed. Jack watched it all with a mixture of relief and amazement. The workshop was standing, and Ray remained impassive, as if this operation had been just another ordinary day at work. Davidson walked past the handcuffed bikers, crossing his arms and watching with a satisfied smile. "This place should go down in the history books," he said. "I've never seen a mechanic turn a workshop into a fortress like this." Ray stood in the doorway, his expression serious, but with a glint in his eye that Jack was beginning to recognize. It wasn't arrogance, but the certainty that what had been done was the right thing. He walked over to Jack and patted him lightly on the shoulder. "Do you think we can still work today?" he asked, as if there wasn't a battalion of police officers and federal vehicles around. Jack laughed, not believing the question. "Work? Ray, did you see what just happened?" Ray just smiled and shrugged. "Of course I saw, but the engines won't fix themselves." Jack shook his head, but this time his smile was genuine. He knew that for Ray. The garage was more than a place to work. It was his home. And even with the battle scars all around, Ray knew that the best way to keep everything he loved was to continue living the way he had always lived, with discipline, effort, and loyalty. As they entered the workshop, a uniformed figure approached. It was Sheriff Grant Matheson, a burly man with a neatly trimmed beard and a stern look in his eyes. He removed his hat and rubbed his sweaty forehead as he surveyed the scene of destruction. Ray, Davidson, I'm not even going to ask how you managed to do all this without calling me first, the sheriff said, his tone half exasperated, half impressed. Seems like half the county has heard about the fight around here. Davidson gave a low chuckle. We called whoever needed to know, Sheriff. And I don't know if you noticed, but it seems to have worked. Grant snorted, but his eyes betrayed a gleam of admiration. The whole town was terrified when they heard about the attack. I thought we were going to have a massacre. Instead, you dismantled a group that had been terrorizing the streets for years. Ray crossed his arms, still with a calm expression. It was either that or let them continue. You know how it works, Grant. Intimidation only works as long as no one fights back. The sheriff nodded, his expression grim. And you reacted in a way they will never forget. Grant's radio crackled, interrupting the conversation. Sheriff, we have everything under control. All routes are blocked. The last fugitives have been intercepted, a firm voice informed. Grant nodded at the radio and looked at Ray. Ramirez must be furious somewhere right now. This all ended up being a direct hit to his organization. Ray didn't answer right away. He knew that the Ramirez cartel was not just a local group of criminals, but a well-connected and dangerous network. The defeat of the Iron Vultures would not be easily forgotten. Let him rage, Ray muttered finally. The more noise he makes, the faster we can take down the rest of the operation. Grant watched Ray carefully, then extended his hand. Thank you. Seriously, I think not only Redstone but the entire region owes you and your friends a favor. Ray shook the sheriff's hand firmly. No need to thank me, Grant. That's why we do what we do. Little by little, the federal team began to dismantle their perimeter. A few curious townspeople appeared in the surrounding area, watching from afar, but no one dared to get too close. People were still trying to figure out what exactly had happened in the workshop. The Iron Vultures had come like a hurricane and had been swept away like dust. Davidson approached Jack with a smile. Hey, kid. First attack successfully repelled. Not bad, huh? Jack laughed, but still looked incredulous. Not bad. I thought I was going to die of fright. And he paused and looked around. But, I get it. Why you were so calm the whole time? You knew everyone was prepared. You trusted them. Davidson nodded. Trust is everything, Jack. Without it, we're just a bunch of guys trying to survive. But when we trust each other, we become a team. Ray appeared beside them, a can of soda in his hand and a tired smile. And with the right team, even a workshop can be the safest place in the world. Jack looked at Ray with renewed admiration. He finally understood that Ray was not just a man with a mysterious past. He was a leader, someone who knew what it meant to protect what truly mattered. As the sun began to set, Ray walked to the garage entrance and stopped, looking out at the now deserted road. The dust kicked up by the bikes had settled, and everything was silent. The sky was tinged with gold and orange, a peaceful farewell to a day that would never be forgotten. Jack walked over and stood beside him. And now? What do we do tomorrow? Ray took a sip of his soda and looked out at the horizon with a half smile. Tomorrow, we go back to work. Jack laughed, finally feeling at peace. Ray put his hand on Jack's shoulder and said in a low but firm voice, They picked the wrong target, Jack, and now the whole world knows it. The Iron Haven workshop was intact. The old mechanic remained firm. And that night, Redstone slept peacefully, knowing that no one else would dare mess with the man who had faced an army and won. The following days were marked by an almost surreal calm in Redstone. The dust from the confrontation had settled, but stories about what happened at the Iron Haven workshop continued to spread like wildfire. Every corner of the city echoed different rumors and versions. Some said that Ray faced the Iron Vultures alone. Others swore that the workshop was full of traps like in an action movie. But regardless of the version, one thing was certain. Ray Carter had become a legend. The city, which had previously maintained a peaceful and quiet routine, now seemed more awake, more united. The merchants and residents, who had previously walked the streets in fear, now walked with renewed confidence. The message was clear. No one would intimidate Redstone anymore. On a Friday morning, Jack arrived at the shop early, as he had done since the incident. But this time he brought something different. A battered notebook covered in notes. He walked into Iron Haven to find Ray already at work, adjusting a part under the hood of an old car. "Good morning, Ray," Jack said, placing the notebook on the counter. Ray glanced quickly and then went back to work. "It seems like you have a project," he commented in a neutral tone. Jack smiled excitedly. "It's more than a project. I'm thinking about improving the workshop." He pointed to the notebook. "Here are some ideas. More cameras, reinforced doors, maybe even an automatic alert system for when suspicious motorcycles approach." Ray calmly wiped his hands and looked at Jack, his expression a mixture of pride and caution. "I like the initiative, but—" "Jack, why so much reinforcement now that they've been defeated?" he asked. Jack looked serious for a moment before answering. "Because it's not just about the shop, it's about the city. What happened here showed that we can defend ourselves, but it also showed that we're still on the radar of dangerous people. I don't want Redstone to be a target again." Ray nodded slowly, taking in the boy's words. He picked up the notebook and began flipping through it, examining the drawings and ideas written down with a careful eye. "You're learning fast, Jack," Ray said with a slight smile. "But protection isn't just about preparing for war. It's also about showing strength without having to use it." Jack watched him silently, waiting for what to continue. "Sometimes being strong is enough to keep a war from starting," Ray added, placing the notebook on the workbench. "And you're already helping the city more than you think. But we can't turn the shop into a military base. We're still mechanics." Jack let out a laugh. "Mechanics who know how to set up defenses like no one else, right?" Ray laughed along and gave Jack a light slap on the back. "That is true." As they discussed the improvements, the sound of tires arriving caught both of their attention. They stepped outside and saw a black car pull up slowly in front of the shop. The vehicle had no ordinary license plates, and its immaculate shine contrasted with the dust that covered the road. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in a gray suit got out with a neutral but careful expression. His gaze swept the shop before landing on Ray. Jack frowned. "Who is that? He doesn't look like he's from around here." Ray crossed his arms and waited as the man approached with controlled steps. "Ray Carter?" asked the stranger, in a deep voice. Ray nodded, not moving. "It depends on who's asking." The man smiled politely and extended his hand. "My name is Henry Alvarez, a special agent with the Department of Justice. I'm here because of what happened with the Iron Vultures, and most importantly, because the fallout from the operation against Ramirez has reached Washington." Ray narrowed his eyes. He didn't like being visited by men in suits. It usually meant trouble. "And what do you want with me, Agent Alvarez?" Alvarez lowered his hand when he realized Ray wasn't going to shake it and continued in a firm but respectful tone. "Your operation has dismantled one of Ramirez's main distribution routes and drawn our attention. We now know he has lost a lot of power, but we also know that men like him don't stand still. Ramirez may be cornered, but he's not out of the picture." Ray was silent for a few moments before asking, "Is he coming after Redstone?" Alvarez hesitated for a second before finally saying, "We don't know yet, but it could. And that's why I'm here. I want to offer support, protection, resources to make sure it doesn't happen again." Jack looked at Ray expectantly. Part of him thought this would be a good idea, but Ray's expression remained impenetrable. "I appreciate the offer, Agent. But Redstone doesn't need federal agents patrolling our streets. We need our own force," Ray replied, crossing his arms. Alvarez let out a sigh. "I expected that answer. But know this. If you need anything at all, we'll be ready to help." Ray nodded briefly, but his posture remained reserved. "I'll remember that." Alvarez took one last look at the shop and got back into his car, leaving a light trail of dust as he started the engine and drove off down the road. Jack watched the vehicle disappear into the distance before turning to Ray. "Why did you refuse?" he asked, intrigued. Ray looked at Jack and shrugged. "Because men like Alvarez come with promises, but, in the end, they always charge something." Jack was thoughtful, but didn't argue. He knew Ray saw things he didn't yet fully understand. As the day wore on, the shop's routine returned to normal. Truckers and drivers stopped by to pick up or drop off their vehicles, and Iron Haven resumed its role in the city, not just as a place to fix engines, but as a symbol of safety and resilience. But that night, as Ray stared out at the deserted road beneath the starlight, he knew there was still a long way to go. Ramirez was no ordinary enemy, and even with the vultures defeated, Redstone would still need to remain vigilant. Ray took a deep breath, the smell of oil and metal still strong in the air. Jack appeared with 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to him. "So, do you think he'll try again?" Jack asked. Ray took a sip and looked out at the dark horizon. "He will," he replied calmly, "but we will be ready." Jack nodded, and the two of them fell silent, watching the still night. If Ramirez or anyone else tried again, they now knew the battle would be different. Because the lesson had been learned. When faced with a community united and led by a man who is not afraid to fight, even the most powerful learn to fear. The next few weeks were quieter, but no less intense. The Iron Haven workshop had returned to its normal routine, with Ray and Jack serving customers and making repairs. Still, the air was thick with a silent watchfulness. Everyone in Redstone knew that the battle against the Iron Vultures was just one chapter in a larger story. Ramirez was still a shadow looming in the distance, and the wounds of that recent war had yet to fully heal. Jack was learning more every day. He had gone from being just an apprentice to almost Ray's right-hand man. His enthusiasm was palpable, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The confrontation had changed him, for the better. He moved around the shop with more confidence, knowing he had found his place. It was a quiet afternoon when an old truck with peeling paint and an engine that made a misfiring noise pulled up in front of the garage. The driver got out, looking tired but grateful. It was Sam Duggan, a well-known trucker in town and a longtime customer of Ray's. Sam was a big man with a thick beard and strong arms, but that afternoon he seemed smaller, as if he were carrying the weight of something other than the fatigue of a long trip. Ray wiped his hands with a cloth and walked over to him, noticing his worried expression. "Sam, what's wrong?" Ray asked, with his usual calm. Sam scratched his head and sighed. "Ray, something weird happened on the road. I passed the old I-47 gas station, and there were these figures there. Motorcycles parked. Men looking around like they were hunting something. It wasn't the vultures, but they had the same energy, you know?" Ray narrowed his eyes. "How many?" "About 6 or 7. They seemed to be waiting for someone or something. I thought it best not to ask." Jack, who was behind Ray, exchanged a quick glance with him and immediately became alert. "It could just be a coincidence," Jack suggested, more to convince himself than to truly believe it. Ray shook his head slowly. "Coincidences don't exist in places like this, Jack, especially not after everything that's happened." Sam looked at Ray seriously. "Ray, they had a symbol on their jacket. It wasn't a skull. It was a snake wrapped around an axe." Ray stood still for a moment. Jack noticed the subtle change in Ray's expression. It wasn't surprise, and it was recognition. "Do you know?" Jack asked, worried. Ray nodded slowly. "Iron Serpents," he murmured. "They are not just any group. They are mercenaries, allies of cartels, including Ramirez." The silence that followed was oppressive. Sam looked at Ray with growing concern. "What do I do, Ray? Close the roots for a while." Ray placed his hand firmly on Sam's shoulder. "No, keep driving, but stay alert. If you notice anything strange again, let me know immediately. Don't let them know you're watching." Sam nodded, clearly relieved to have someone like Ray on his side. "Don't worry, Ray. I trust you." Sam got back into the truck and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust on the road. Jack stood beside Ray, still trying to process the information. "Iron serpents. Mercenaries?" Jack asked, his voice thick with unease. "So, this isn't over, is it?" Ray took a deep breath and looked out into the distance, where Sam's truck disappeared. "It's not over. Ramirez is responding. And this time, he brought professionals." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the Iron Vultures were brutal, but they were still a chaotic and predictable gang. Mercenaries were something else entirely. They were cool, disciplined, paid to do a job, and they rarely failed. Ray turned and walked back into the workshop, which was already moving. "We're going to reinforce more than the walls now, Jack. We don't know when, but we know they'll come." Jack followed him hurriedly. "Okay. What do we do first?" Ray stopped in front of the tool panel and picked up a wrench, but it wasn't for working on engines. It was more of a matter of habit. He twirled the wrench between his fingers before answering. "First, we warn Davidson and the others. We need to be one step ahead. Then, we set up observation points along the nearby routes. If they want to make this town believe we're alone, they'll see how wrong they are." Dusk came quickly to Redstone, tinting the sky with orange and violet hues. In the house next to the workshop, Ray gathered Davidson and two other veterans who had remained in town. Harris and Connor, two men who had lived through situations that would leave anyone shocked, sat around the wooden table, listening intently to Ray's words. "Iron serpents," Harris said, scratching his red beard. "I didn't think I'd hear that name again." Davidson crossed his arms. "Ramirez is more desperate than we imagined. Sending mercenaries, this isn't just retaliation. He wants to turn this into a show of power." Ray nodded. "Exactly. And if he's bringing them here, it means he's willing to do anything." Connor, who was more reserved, spoke for the first time. "We need to protect more than just the shop, Ray. If these guys show up in force, they'll use everything around them to their advantage. Even people." Ray knew he was right. Mercenaries had no rules or moral codes. They used fear as a tool. "We will protect Redstone, no matter what," Ray replied firmly. The city slept silently that night. But at the Iron Haven workshop, preparations were underway. Jack helped set up extra cameras, while Davidson monitored portable radios for signs of suspicious activity. Harris and Connor reinforced the emergency exits, and Ray did what he always did best, anticipate the enemy's every move. "Jack," Ray called, looking at the young man carrying a hammer and nails. "Remember, they won't expect a friendly welcome, and that's exactly what we're going to give them." Jack nodded, determined. Outside, the night. Wind blew across the deserted road. But everyone knew this was just the prelude to a new battle. And this time, the Iron Serpents would learn the same lesson as the Iron Vultures. When you challenge a man like Ray Carter and his community, no matter how prepared you are still at a disadvantage. The storm was about to start again. The early morning silence in Redstone was profound, broken only by the occasional hum of the wind blowing across the deserted road. The Iron Haven workshop was partially dark, but the soft glow of newly installed cameras flickered on and off, almost like watchful sentries. Jack sat on a makeshift bench near the side door, reviewing his security notes as he sipped strong coffee. His mind was still buzzing with everything he had learned that day. Ray came in from the side, carrying a toolbox, and stopped beside Jack. He watched him for a moment before speaking. "How long have you been awake?" Ray asked, his gaze a mix of tiredness and concern. Jack shrugged. Enough to know I won't be able to sleep. Ray nodded and sat down next to him, letting out a sigh. For a few moments, neither of them said anything. The silence seemed to be a shared understanding. "Is that how it is?" Jack asked, finally breaking the silence. "This feeling that something bad could happen at any moment." Ray took a sip of his own coffee and looked out at the dark horizon. "Yes, and you never completely get used to it," he answered sincerely. "But with time, you learn to act in spite of it." Jack looked at Ray, trying to understand how someone could live so calmly in such tense situations. He wanted to ask more, but the sound of a crackle on the radio caught his attention. Davidson, on the other end of the line, spoke urgently. Movement on the North Road. Motorcycle lights. "Looks like we have company." Jack dropped his coffee cup and ran to grab the radio, but Ray was quicker and answered in a calm, controlled voice. "How many?" Davidson paused briefly, probably using his binoculars to count. 8 motorcycles. "No, 9, and an SUV following behind them. They're not trying to hide." Ray was silent for a moment. He knew this tactic. It was a show of force, a way to announce one's arrival without fear of being noticed. "Davidson, hold position." "Don't engage. Just watch and let me know if they change course," Ray instructed. Jack watched, his breathing heavy. "Is it them? The Iron Serpents?" Ray nodded slowly. "It's them. They're making the first approach. They want to test us." Jack clenched his fists, feeling adrenaline start to course through his body. "So what do we do?" Ray stood up and put his hand on Jack's shoulder, looking him in the eyes. "We are ready." A few minutes later, the shop was completely silent. Davidson and the other veterans positioned themselves around the perimeter, keeping themselves hidden but alert. Each knew exactly what to do. Jack held his breath as he listened for the first sounds of the approaching bikes. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road and the surrounding terrain. The group stopped just outside the garage. The motorcycles cut their engines with almost rehearsed synchronization, and the SUV stayed behind like a silent guardian. Ray walked out the front door of the workshop alone, his steps slow and steady. Jack followed him halfway, but stayed in the shadow of the entrance, watching carefully. He knew better than to intervene. Not yet. The leader of the Iron Serpents was a thin man with an intimidating bearing. He had dark hair tied back in a ponytail and eyes as cold as ice. His leather jacket bore the group's emblem, a snake coiled around an axe, its scales silvery and shining in the moonlight. He got off his bike and walked over to Ray, stopping a few feet away. "Ray Carter," the man said, his voice calm but full of menace. "I've heard a lot about you. It seems you've become a problem, an expensive problem." Ray kept his expression neutral. "I'm not the one who went out of his way to cause trouble. So who's the problem?" "Here." The man smirked and put his hands in his pockets. "My name is Marco Ortega, and unlike those amateurs at Iron Vultures, we don't make mistakes. I'm not here to negotiate or threaten you. I'm here to resolve what Ramirez ordered. Resolved." Ray took a step forward, narrowing his eyes. "If you think you're going to solve it with brute force, you didn't learn anything from last time." Marco raised an eyebrow and looked around, as if analyzing his surroundings. "Brute force? No, this is just a warning," Marco replied, pointing to the SUV. The SUV's door opened, and 2 muscular men got out, dragging something. Jack leaned in a little more to get a better look and felt his stomach drop. He was one of the local truck drivers, Sam Duggan. He had his hands tied and a bleeding cut on the side of his face. "Sam!" Jack shouted, but Ray held up his hand, stopping him from running. Marco gave a slight smile. He tried to be smart, and now he's here as an example. Ray stood still, but Jack could feel the weight of that scene on his shoulders. "Let him go," Ray said, his voice firm. "This can still end without any more blood being shed." Marco gave a short, sarcastic laugh. Do you really believe that, or are you trying to convince me? Ray stood firm. I'm giving you the chance to get out of here before you lose everything. Marco's smile disappeared, replaced by a serious, dangerous expression. We're not the vultures, Carter. There won't be a second chance. Ray looked Marco straight in the eye and spoke coldly. That's what I was going to say. Suddenly, the lights in the workshop and the hidden cameras around it came on in a bright flash, temporarily blinding the men around them. Davidson and Harris and the other veterans emerged from their positions with non-lethal but effective weapons. Smoke bombs and flash grenades were thrown, turning the camp into a controlled confusion zone. Jack rushed to help Sam, who was down, while Ray advanced towards Marco with a speed no one expected. He disarmed one of the mercenaries with a quick blow and spun, landing a precise punch to Marco's jaw, who stumbled backwards. The Iron Serpents tried to fight back, but they were disoriented by the smoke and lights. Ray's strategy was working perfectly. They were not ready for such a well-coordinated counterattack. Davidson pulled Jack and Sam back as the feds, and who had been alerted in advance, arrived with sirens blaring in the distance. Marco, still dazed, looked around and saw his team being neutralized. He slowly stood up and spat out blood before glaring at Ray with hatred. This isn't over, he muttered, before running towards the SUV. Ray watched him run away, but gave no sign of pursuit. He knew that victory was not only physical, but also psychological. Jack helped Sam up, panting but relieved. You were right, Jack said, his voice breaking. They thought they had everything under control, but we were one step ahead. Ray looked at Jack with a half smile, because sometimes it's not about being stronger, it's about being smarter. The battle was won, but everyone knew that the war with Ramirez was far from over. The early morning was filled with the sound of sirens, the flash of red and blue lights cutting through the darkness as federal agents blocked off the main road. Those Iron Serpents who couldn't escape were quickly subdued. Their leader, Marco Ortega, disappeared into the dust kicked up by the SUV. But Ray knew this was only the beginning. Sam Duggan was taken to receive medical attention, still, dazed but grateful to be alive. Jack was by his side, assuring him that he was okay. Thanks, Jack, and Ray, Sam said, his voice shaking. I should have taken your advice and been more careful. Jack squeezed Sam's shoulder with a reassuring smile. You did what you could. You're safe now. That's what matters. Ray approached, his hands still stained with oil and soot, but his posture as firm and unwavering as ever. He watched Sam being led away, and for a moment his gaze drifted off into the distance. Jack knew what that meant. Ray was anticipating the next move. Davidson joined them, arms crossed and a satisfied smile. It was good work, Ray. Those mercenaries didn't know what hit them. But Ortega, he'll be back, and he won't be back alone. Ray nodded slowly. I know, but now we know more about them. We know what they're capable of, and we know that Ramirez is running out of options. He sent in professionals because he can't risk showing himself weak. Jack looked at the police officers who were finishing arresting the last men and frowned. So what happens now? Do we wait for them to attack again? Ray turned to Jack, his eyes serious. No. We took the fight to them. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Davidson raised his eyebrows in surprise. Are you thinking of being offensive? Ray nodded, his gaze resolute. Ramirez thinks he can maintain control because he is always hiding behind henchmen and middlemen. It is time to remind him that we are not victims. He needs to feel that he has lost control. Jack felt a mixture of fear and wonder. He knew this meant getting involved in something bigger, something dangerous, but he also knew there was no other way. The next day, the shop was busier than ever. Davidson and the remaining veterans were reinforcing the last vulnerable spots, while Jack was busy preparing the tools for a surveillance mission. The radios were set to a secure frequency, and a contact network had been activated. Ray spent some time in silence in his small office, reviewing maps and information he had received from former allies. When he finally emerged, he was holding a battered envelope and a serious look in his eyes. "I've got the location of a base of operations used by the Iron Serpents," he announced. "It's about 25 miles away, in an abandoned warehouse that used to be a cargo depot." Jack frowned. "Shall we go there? Isn't that too dangerous?" Davidson intervened, his tone firm but unopposed. "Ray, you know this is a nest of snakes. They won't be unprepared." Ray looked at them with conviction. "We're not going to take down an army. We're going to gather information. We need to understand how they're receiving Ramirez's orders and who they're actually dealing with." Jack felt the weight of that statement. He knew Ray was right, but that didn't make the mission any less risky. By nightfall, the group was ready. Ray, Davidson, Jack, and Harris set off in a low-profile pickup truck. The road was deserted and silent, with only the sound of tires crunching in the sand beneath their wheels. The full moon illuminated part of the way, but the rest was swallowed up in darkness. "Remember, Jack," Ray said quietly as he drove, "we're not here to fight. We're here to observe and understand." Jack nodded, though his heart was pounding. Finally, they reached the observation point, a small rise overlooking the abandoned warehouse. Ray turned off the headlights and signaled for everyone to get into position. The warehouse was a large, run-down building with rusty metal roof, tiles and weather-stained walls. There were a few motorcycles parked outside and an old military jeep. The lights outside were on, and shadows could be seen moving inside. Davidson raised his binoculars and looked closely. 3 men. Outside, 4 more inside, from what I can see. They're armed. Ray studied the place, paying attention to every detail. After a few minutes, he signaled to Harris. "Harris, can you hack their cameras?" Harris smiled confidently and opened his small portable device. "It's almost embarrassing that it's so easy." Jack watched silently as Harris hacked into the warehouse's security system. After a few minutes, the monitor showed footage from inside. The warehouse was more organized than the outside conditions would suggest. Boxes were stacked neatly, and a route map was posted on one wall with red and blue markings. But what caught everyone's attention was the center of the image. Marco Ortega was there, talking to a man they didn't recognize. He was a man with a stern appearance and restless eyes, as if he was always waiting to be betrayed. "Who's that?" Jack whispered. Ray narrowed his eyes. "I don't know. But he's important. And if he's here, it's because Ramirez ordered reinforcement of the operation." Harris recorded the footage while Davidson kept watch. "Do we have what we need?" Davidson asked cautiously. Ray nodded. "We do. We know that Ramirez is doubling down and that his movement is bigger than we thought." Jack looked at Ray, still hesitant. "So, what do we do now?" Ray took a deep breath before answering. "We go back and prepare the next move. Ramirez is playing a dangerous game, and now we know the rules." They began to retreat, in silence, but Jack felt something shift inside him. He was no longer the unprepared young man he had been. Now he was part of the real fight, and he knew that with Ray leading the way, they had a chance to turn the tide. But Ray's gaze, still focused on the horizon, made it clear the worst was yet to come. The truck's engine hummed softly as Ray and his group drove back to Iron Haven. No one said a word as they drove. The silence was filled with the weight of the information they had gathered. Jack's gaze was fixed on the road, but his mind was replaying every detail of the scene they had seen at the warehouse. Marco Ortega was more organized and better armed than they had imagined, and the mysterious man beside him did not appear to be just another pawn in Ramirez's operation. When they finally arrived at the shop, Ray parked the truck next to the shed and turned off the engine. The group quickly got out and entered the shop, which now seemed safer than ever. with cameras monitoring every corner and the doors reinforced, with steel plates. Davidson was the first to break the silence. This man, whoever he is, he's not there by chance. Ortega may be the front line, but that guy is the brains behind the next plays. Ray walked over to the counter and rested his hands on the wooden top, taking a deep breath. His gaze was hard but focused. Exactly. Ramirez is a calculating man. He doesn't waste resources sending second-tier leaders to smaller operations. If that man is in the warehouse, it's because he's part of something bigger. Jack, who was still holding one of the printed images Harris had taken from the recordings, shook his head, trying to understand. But bigger how? What would be the next step? They lost the iron serpents they sent the other night. Why reinforce something that already went wrong? Ray looked at Jack and smiled slightly, without humor. Because they don't care about losing. They want to make an example of this city. Ramirez can't afford to look weak to the other groups he does business with. If Redstone becomes a symbol of resistance, other places might follow suit. He can't let that happen. Davidson nodded and crossed his arms. So he doesn't just want to destroy the workshop. He wants to send a message. Exactly, Ray confirmed. And that's why we need to change the narrative before they corner us. Harris closed his laptop and turned to the group. I've managed to track their communication signal. They're using secure frequencies, but nothing. I can't decipher given enough time. The good news is that they're constantly communicating with another base. Davidson raised his eyebrows. Another base? Yes, Harris confirmed, a gleam in his eyes. And I bet that's where they're keeping the real arsenal. If we can intercept it, we can cut off their supplies and weaken them. Ray pondered for a moment. He knew this was a risky chance, but if it worked, it could definitely turn the tide in his favor. What's the location? Ray asked directly. Harris pointed to a spot on the map. An old freight depot near Echo Ridge, about 20 minutes north. They're probably using it as a transit point to move weapons and reinforcements. Davidson took a deep breath. It seems like a legitimate target, but if we're wrong, we could be walking into a trap. Ray looked at Davidson with the seriousness of a leader who has weighed all the possibilities. Every action has risks, Davidson, but standing still is not an option. This isn't just about the workshop. This is about all of Redstone. If we let this go, they'll consume the city like a disease. Jack clenched his fists and nodded. I'm with you, Ray. Davidson and Harris exchanged glances, and after a few seconds, they nodded as well. The group was united. Night fell over Redstone again, but this time there was no silence. The city still breathed cautiously, as if feeling the weight of unseen threats. The group set off again toward the outpost, carrying only the essentials: portable radios, low-beam flashlights, a few improvised tools, and determination. The road to Echo Ridge was narrow, lined with cliffs and trees that rustled in the wind. Ray drove with his lights low, keeping a steady speed to avoid arousing suspicion. As they approached the entrance to the outpost, he stopped the truck and turned off the engine. They would walk the rest of the way. You know what to do, Ray murmured, giving each of them a steady look. Move quietly, observe everything, and let me know if there's any sign of something wrong. They nodded and walked in. Formation, with Ray leading the way. As they approached the warehouse, they could see a few shadows moving around the entrances. 2 guards were posted near the main gate, absently smoking, but Ray knew there would be more inside. Harris crouched down next to a rock and began picking up signals with his equipment. After a few minutes, he looked up with a satisfied look. I've picked up a transmission, he whispered. It sounds like something big is coming. A shipment coming straight from another state. Ray narrowed his eyes. So Ramirez is expanding his operation. He doesn't just want to maintain control. He wants to turn Redstone into a distribution point. Davidson approached, crouching down. What's the plan? Do we intercept or document? Ray was silent for a few moments before answering. We document it. If we can get concrete evidence, we not only take down the henchman, we take down Ramirez. Jack held up his makeshift camera, adjusting the focus to capture images through a hole in the corroded wall of the warehouse. He saw a row of boxes marked with counterfeit stamps, and beside them, men carrying automatic rifles. His heart raced, but he kept recording. Suddenly, a snap of a broken twig echoed behind them. Davidson turned around instantly, gun in hand. "We have company," he whispered. One of the warehouse guards had gotten too close and was now staring at them with wide eyes. Before he could scream, Ray stepped forward with precision and knocked him down with a swift blow, muffling the sound with his hand. They dragged the man out of sight and tied him up tightly. "We need to get out of here," Davidson said. "They'll notice he's missing." Ray looked at Jack, who still had the camera in his hands. "Did you get enough?" Jack nodded. "Yes, we got everything." Ray motioned for everyone to retreat calmly. They began to return the way they had come, avoiding the lights, and keeping to the shadows. The group knew that every step now could determine their fate. When they finally made it back to the truck, everyone let out a small sigh of relief. But Ray remained serious as he started the engine and sped off toward Redstone. Jack looked at him, still feeling the adrenaline rushing through his veins. "What do we do now?" Ray gripped the steering wheel tightly. "We show the world what they're made of. And then we put an end to it all." The war against Ramirez was about to reach its climax, and Ray knew there was no turning back. The drive back to Iron Haven was marked by a tense silence. Jack held the camera in his lap, his fingers clenched around it, as if it held proof of a secret that could change everything. Davidson stared out the window, alert for any suspicious movement on the road, while Harris reviewed the files on his small laptop to make sure everything was intact. Ray drove with his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind worked quickly, reviewing every detail of what they had seen at the outpost. The weapons shipment, the meticulous logistics scheme, and most of all, the mysterious man standing next to Marco Ortega. Nothing here was random. Ramirez was building something big, and Redstone City was just one piece on a much larger board. When they arrived at the shop, Ray got out of the truck and looked around, checking that everything was in order before going in. Jack and the others followed, eager to organize the next step. "Let's go through all this and prepare the files," Ray said firmly. "If we want to bring down Ramirez, we need irrefutable evidence." Inside the workshop, Harris connected the camera to his laptop and began transferring the videos. The footage was a bit shaky at times, but it was clear enough to show the illegal shipment, the faces of the henchmen, and even part of the conversation between Ortega and his mysterious ally. "Look at this," Harris muttered, pointing at the screen. He paused the video at a specific point, a map pinned to the wall of the warehouse. It was covered in red markings, indicating routes and strategic points. "They're not just using redstone. They're creating a distribution network that cuts across several states." Davidson frowned and crossed his arms. "This confirms the worst. Ramirez is expanding faster than we imagined." Jack looked at the map, with a mixture of anger and concern. "And we're right in the middle of it." Ray nodded. "Exactly. But now we know the entry and exit points. We know where they're going to attack, and we can prepare." Jack looked at Ray, his heart racing. "Do you really think we have a chance? There are so many of them, and they have almost unlimited resources." Ray placed a hand on Jack's shoulder and spoke firmly. "Chance? No, Jack. We're not talking about chances. We're talking about choices. They chose to come here and think they could dominate everything. We chose to fight. This isn't about numbers. It's about knowing what's at stake and not backing down." Jack took a deep breath and nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He trusted Ray more than he had ever trusted anyone. Later that evening, Ray met again with Davidson, Harris, and Jack in the small makeshift conference room at the back of the workshop. The map they had captured was enlarged on the wall, with hand-drawn markings over the known routes. Davidson, pointed to a specific spot. "This here is their main depot, the place where we saw the shipment being prepared. If we cut that connection, we'll stop distribution for weeks." Ray nodded, but his eyes were fixed on another point on the map. "And this one," he said, pointing to another route, marked with a red X. "It's a secondary route they're using to avoid the main highways. If we can alert the right authorities, we can force Ramirez to act more quickly and more incorrectly." Harris let out a suppressed laugh. "Press him until he loses his mind. I like that." Ray turned to the group with a determined expression. "That's it. Let's divide up the tasks. Davidson, you lead the enforcement of the local roads. No one comes or goes without our knowledge. Harris, get everything ready to send this evidence to trusted contacts. And Jack, you come with me." Jack's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? Where to?" Ray picked up a set of keys and looked at Jack with a tired but determined smile. "Let's go to Sheriff Grant's office. It's time to get the Redstone Sheriff back in the game and make sure he's on our side." Sheriff Grant's house was on the outskirts of town, a simple property surrounded by tall trees and a weathered porch. Dim lights were on, and the sound of a radio playing country music could be heard through the open window. Ray parked the car and got out, followed by Jack. They approached calmly and knocked on the door. A few seconds later, the imposing figure of Sheriff Grant appeared, wearing a flannel shirt and holding a mug of coffee. "Ray," Grant said, surprised. "Jack, what are you guys doing here at this hour?" Ray looked the sheriff straight in the eye. "We need to talk, Grant, about Ramirez." The sheriff's tired smile faded, and he frowned before opening the door and letting them in. The conversation with Grant was intense. Ray showed him the images and explained everything they had discovered. The sheriff was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the evidence that was scrolling across the laptop screen. "I knew Ramirez was still active, but I didn't realize he was trying to turn Redstone into a distribution point," Grant said, his voice low but filled with anger. "I won't let that happen." Ray nodded. "We need your help, Grant. We can't win this alone. If we can mobilize the few officers we trust and work with the right team, we can stop this before they can solidify their operation." Grant took a deep breath, and after a few seconds, he placed the coffee mug on the table with a bang. "Okay, I'm with you." Jack couldn't help but smile. The city finally had a strong ally on the right side. "What do we do now?" Grant asked, as he began to sift through a stack of old reports. Ray stood up and looked out the window. At the darkness outside, "We've got Redstone ready, because when Ramirez finds out we're messing with his lines, he'll come at us with everything." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of the wind blowing. But everyone there knew it was the calm before the final storm. Ramirez's attack would be brutal, but the difference now was clear. Redstone was united, and whoever dared to defy the city would learn, as the others had, the hardest lesson of all. When you defy Ray Carter, you don't just face one man, you face an entire community that refuses to be intimidated. The war was coming to a head, and Ray was ready to face it. The early morning wind was blowing hard as Ray, Jack, and Sheriff Grant stepped out onto the porch of the house. The lights of the city in the distance twinkled like tiny stars in the darkness. The moment of calm was almost illusory, like the silence before the thunder. They knew that at any moment all hell could break loose on Redstone. Grant took a deep breath and looked at Ray. "I've never seen anything like this before, Ray. This city has seen storms before, but nothing compared to what we're about to face." Ray crossed his arms and looked at the deserted road. "This isn't just about the city, Grant. It's about showing that no one can use fear and power to break honest people." Jack, who had been watching the two in silence, finally spoke, his voice firm. "And this time we won't just resist, we'll fight back." Grant gave a slight smile of approval. "Good to hear that, kid." Ray turned to Grant with his usual serious expression. Mobilize your trusted men and prepare patrols. We will need to block strategic routes. If Ramirez sends reinforcements, we need to know before they get close. Grant nodded and approached the door. Consider it done. But what about the rest of the city? Do you think they're ready for this? Ray looked at Jack before answering. Let's make sure they are. As the sun rose over Redstone that morning, the town was already bracing itself. Davidson and the other veterans set up makeshift checkpoints on back roads. Volunteer truckers set up roadblocks with their own vehicles, and local businesses closed their doors, not out of fear, but to help protect their families. Beth, who owns the downtown cafe, came out with thermoses of coffee and lunchboxes for the volunteers. No one will fight on an empty stomach, she said, with a defiant smile. Jack and Ray stood in front of Iron Haven, coordinating the last defenses. Jack looked around, seeing the movement of people united by the same purpose. I never thought I'd see anything like this, he murmured. Everyone together, without fear. Ray put his hand on Jack's shoulder. They're afraid. And Jack, they just won't let it stop them. That's what makes a strong community. Jack nodded, feeling inspired. The afternoon passed in a blur, and tension mounted as the sun set below the horizon. Then came the news everyone had been waiting for, but not wanting. Davidson's radio crackled with Harris's urgent voice. Convoy detected, main road. Coming from the east, black SUVs, at least 4, and more than 20 motorcycles behind them. Jack's heart raced. It was time. Davidson picked up the radio and replied in a firm voice. Confirmed. Everyone in position. Ray turned to Jack, his gaze determined. It's time. You know what to do. Jack took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, and ran to position, himself at the main entrance of the workshop, where the first line of defense was. Ray approached Davidson and Grant, who were already ready. They're coming in full force, Davidson said, his tone a mix of concern and anticipation. Ray nodded. Perfect. Because now we're going to show them what happens when they try to hack into Redstone. The sound of the engines approached like the roar of a storm. Dust rose on the road as the convoy advanced, and the glare of the headlights seemed like the teeth of a hungry monster. Marco Ortega was in the first SUV, a cruel smile on his face. He expected to find a frightened and abandoned city, but when he crossed the first intersection and saw the barrier set up, his smile disappeared. Redstone's volunteers stood there, standing firm, staring at the convoy with determined eyes. Davidson stood at the front of the line, his arms crossed like an unwavering sentry. Marco opened the window and shouted, Do you really think you can stop this? You're just a handful of civilians against an unstoppable force. Davidson stepped forward, unafraid. We are not civilians. We are a community, and you do not belong here. Marco gritted his teeth, but before he could give the order to advance, a boom echoed in the distance. Ray, who was in a strategic position with Grant and Jack, watched everything calmly. He had prepared a perfect trap. Time to say hello, Ray muttered, nodding to Jack. Jack picked up a remote and pressed a button. Strategically placed lights came on, blinding drivers and creating momentary confusion. At the same time, Harris activated the makeshift speakers, and loud sirens and mechanical noises filled the air. Motorcycles skidded, SUVs screeched to a halt, and Ortega's men screamed, trying to understand what was happening. Chaos ensued. Ray led the counterattack with precision. Davidson and the other veterans advanced from the flanks, taking advantage of the disorientation. The motorcycles began to topple over, and the SUVs got stuck on the blocked road. Marco Ortega got out of the vehicle with a gun in his hand, furious, but before he could shoot, Ray appeared in front of him. The war ends here, Ortega. Marco raised his gun, but Ray was faster. With a precise movement, he disarmed Ortega and immobilized him, knocking him to the ground with force. Ramirez won't use this city anymore, Ray said, his voice full of determination. Ortega screamed in rage, but his fight ended when Grant and his men arrived to arrest him. The remaining motorcycles fled, and the convoy was completely dismantled. The entire city erupted in shouts of victory. Jack ran to Ray, his heart still racing. "We did it, Ray! We did it!" Ray took a deep breath and smiled slightly. "It wasn't just us, Jack. Everyone here made this happen." Hours later, the Iron Haven workshop was packed with residents celebrating. The city had won, but the credit didn't go to one lone hero. It went to everyone who refused to live in fear. Davidson raised a bottle and toasted, "To Redstone, may you never bow down to anyone." The screams echoed throughout the place. But amidst the celebration, Ray looked at the horizon with a distant gaze. He knew Ramirez was still out there, but now, Redstone had something he could never destroy: unity. Jack noticed Ray's distant look and approached. "Are you thinking about your next step?" Ray looked at him and smiled. "Yes, but for now, let's enjoy the victory." The night wind blew gently, as if the city could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The war was far from over, but that night, Redstone proved himself unshakable. The full moon cast a cold, silvery light over Redstone as the city recovered from its victory over the Iron Serpent convoy. The celebratory mood in the Iron Haven workshop was beginning to fade, replaced by a reflective silence. People were returning to their homes, exhausted but relieved. Ray Carter, however, did not share their relief. He was standing on the porch of the workshop, watching the empty road in the distance, as if waiting for something. Jack approached, carrying a bottle of water. "I know you're on edge," Jack said, offering the bottle. "But we did it. They escaped. Ortega is in jail. That should be a reason to relax, at least for today." Ray accepted the bottle, but did not drink. "That was just the second act, Jack," he said quietly. "Ramirez hasn't moved yet. Ortega was just the tip of the iceberg. Ramirez can't let it end like this, not without fighting back." Jack stared at the dark road, trying to figure out the cartel's next move. "And what can he do?" Ray turned to Jack, his face drawn with weariness, but with a fierce gleam in his eyes. "Everything, and that's exactly what he's going to try. He's going to come in full force. He's going to turn Redstone into a battlefield if necessary. And this time, he's not going to send messages or intermediaries." Jack swallowed hard. He knew Ray was right. The next morning, the city awoke to an eerie silence. There was no movement on the nearby roads, nor the distant sound of motorcycles. That usually roamed the area. It was an oppressive silence, like the vacuum before a storm. Davidson entered the workshop with hurried steps. "We have a problem, Ray. Our contacts report that an even larger convoy left a base near the border last night. It's not just motorcycles and SUVs this time. They're coming with armored trucks and reinforcements." Ray frowned. "Armored trucks. They're going to try to take the city for good." Grant arrived soon after, looking worried. "I just got a call. The city's power has been cut off at 3 major points. They want to completely isolate us." Ray took a deep breath and looked around at everyone. "So that's it. Ramirez is bringing the full weight of his organization to bear. He wants to wipe Redstone off the map." "And what do we do?" Jack asked, his voice breaking. Ray walked over to the workbench and picked up a set of tools and some portable radios. "We do what we've always done, Jack. We fight back." Over the next few hours, the Iron Haven workshop was transformed into a veritable defense post. Barricades were reinforced, main streets were blocked with abandoned trucks and vehicles, and all volunteers were given detailed instructions. Ray positioned himself at the center of everything, commanding every detail. "Davidson, keep the lookouts on the access roads. If there's any movement, I want to know before they get close. Harris, handle communications. Jack, you come with me." Jack, though nervous, nodded. He had trained for this and had no intention of backing down now. Grant walked over, holding his radio. "I've gotten reinforcements from neighboring cities. Some old colleagues promised to send patrols to surround the area, but it's going to take a while. We'll have to hold our own until then. Ray nodded. We will hold. But we will not just defend. We will attack when the time is right. The sun was already high when the sounds of engines began to echo in the distance. It was no longer an ordinary roar. It was the heavy, steady sound of a column of military vehicles. Ray and Jack stood on top of one of the workshop structures, watching through binoculars. The convoy was impressive. 3 armored trucks, several motorcycles and SUVs, all moving forward with precision. In the center was a black SUV, different from the others, with tinted windows. Ray lowered the binoculars and clenched his fist. It's Ramirez. He came in person. Jack felt his stomach turn. So that's it. Ray looked at him with a half smile. Yes, Jack, it's the end. But for them. The first attack began with a controlled explosion. Harris triggered a containment charge they had prepared on one of the secondary bridges. The first truck in the convoy lost control and slid off the road, rolling onto its side. Immediately, Ramirez's men began to spread out, trying to reorganize their formation. But Ray had anticipated every move. Now! He shouted over the radio. Davidson and his group opened fire with non-lethal ammunition, targeting the tires of vehicles and motorcycles. The streets of Redstone became an ambush field, with veterans and volunteers emerging from strategic points. Ramirez stepped out of the SUV with a cold, furious expression. He pulled out a radio and began shouting orders. Advance! Destroy everything! Don't let anyone escape! But chaos reigned. Ray's defenses were more complex than Ramirez had expected. Every corner, every alley, held a surprise. As one of the armored trucks tried to advance, it was hit by a second controlled explosion. Ramirez walked into the thick of the battle, drawing a pistol. He wasn't a man to stay in the shadows when the situation got out of hand, but Ray was waiting for him. Ray got down from his position and walked down the street towards Ramirez. Here we are, Ramirez, Ray shouted, his voice echoing above the din. Just you and me now. Ramirez turned, eyes narrowed with hatred. Do you really think you can stop this, Carter? Ray kept walking, never taking his eyes off him. I don't believe it. I know. Ramirez raised his gun, but before he could fire, Jack came up from the side and fired a flash grenade. The flash blinded Ramirez for a few seconds, long enough for Ray to advance. With a quick, precise move, he disarmed the cartel leader and threw him to the ground. The fight was intense, with punches and blows exchanged at a brutal pace. Ramirez was strong, but Ray fought with something more powerful, determination and the will to protect everything he loved. With one last sure blow, Ray knocked Ramirez down, who fell to the ground, bloodied and panting. You lost, Ray said, his voice firm. Sirens began to echo in the distance. Reinforcements had finally arrived. The battle ended with the arrest of Ramirez and the last of his men. The entire city watched as the feds took the cartel leader away in handcuffs. Grant approached Ray, looking respectful. It's done. Ray looked at the residents of Redstone, many still gathered in the street, celebrating and hugging each other. Yes, it's done. Jack smiled, exhausted but relieved. We did it. Ray put his hand on Jack's shoulder. Yes, and now Redstone is free. As night fell, Redstone was at peace again. Iron Haven still bore the marks of battle, but its luster remained intact. Ray, Jack, and the others sat on the porch, watching the stars. Do you think they'll try again? Jack asked. Ray smiled slightly. Maybe, but now they know. Redstone is no place to invade, and if they try— He raised his water bottle in an impromptu toast. They'll find out all over again that they picked the wrong target. The war was over, the city was united, and its message was clear. Here, no one would be bullied again. The next day dawned with a different air in Redstone. The dust of the battle was still settling, but the town was already pulsing with life. Residents walked the streets with smiles of relief, greeting each other with hugs and handshakes. Church. Bells rang in the distance, not in mourning, but in celebration of a new era. At Iron Haven, the cleanup and rebuilding work had begun early. Davidson and Harris hauled away debris while Jack put the tools back where they belonged. Despite the scars of battle, there was a sense of victory in the air. The damaged walls were just reminders of what they had overcome together. Ray Carter stood in the doorway, arms crossed and a serene look on his face. For the first time in years, he felt like a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Jack approached, sweaty and with a cleaning rag slung over his shoulder. "You know, Ray, I still can't believe it. Ramirez, Ortega, they're all gone. There are no more shadows lurking around Redstone." Ray let out a sigh and looked around, seeing the residents helping to rebuild with smiles on their faces. "It's not the shadows that make people tremble, Jack," he said with a slight smile. "It's the thought that they're alone against them. And now," Ray pointed to the people carrying planks and helping to build new barricades, "now they know they're not alone." Jack nodded, understanding the depth of Ray's words. He looked out over the horizon, and for the first time felt like he was part of something bigger. He was no longer the curious boy who had sought to learn from Ray. He was a defender of his community, someone who had faced danger head-on and lived to tell the tale. Hours later, Grant arrived with a few federal officers to finalize the POW reports and confer with town leaders. The sheriff was calmer than he had been in recent memory. He patted Ray on the shoulder before heading into the shop. "The city is safe because of you," Grant said with a smile. "And because of this workshop." Ray shook his head. "Thanks to all of us. If there's one thing Ramirez never understood, it's that a community can't be bought, bullied, or torn down when it's united." Grant nodded respectfully and turned to the group of villagers around him. "So, what are you going to do now, Ray?" The question hung in the air for a few seconds. Everyone in the workshop turned to hear the answer. Ray smirked and straightened his posture. "Well, I'm a mechanic. I still have a lot of work to finish. There are engines to fix, oil filters to change, and a whole city that needs its trucks running." Davidson's laughter echoed through the workshop. "Yeah, boss, and Iron Haven is still the best place for it." Everyone laughed, and the tension in the air finally disappeared. Late in the afternoon, Jack walked out onto the garage porch with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Ray and sat down next to it, looking out at the now quiet road. "Do you think any other threats will appear?" Jack asked after a sip. Ray looked at him with a firm but calm gaze. "There will always be someone trying to take over what doesn't belong to them. That's inevitable. But now Redstone knows how to react. We're no longer an easy target, not after what happened here." Jack smiled and looked into the distance, seeing the truckers getting back on the road and the locals reopening their stores. "I think you're right. They picked the wrong target." Ray raised his mug in an impromptu toast. "They will always choose the wrong target, because here, we do not bow down." Jack raised his mug and toasted Ray. As the sun set, casting orange and gold hues over Redstone, the city seemed more alive than ever. Iron Haven stood as a symbol not just of resistance, but of something greater, proof that when people stand together, no force can tear them down. And so Ray Carter, the veteran mechanic who wanted nothing more than to live in peace, had transformed his shop into a bastion of justice and freedom. Redstone was no longer a mere dot on the map, it was a reminder to all who dared to intimidate it. Here, people did not fight alone. And anyone who came expecting to find weakness would find too late that they had chosen the wrong place. Ray finished his coffee, stood up, and took one last look at the road before heading back inside. "Come on, Jack. We still have a lot of work to do." Jack stood up, smiling broadly. "All right, boss. Back to action." And with that, the door to the Iron Haven workshop closed again, not as a place of resistance, but as a home of hope, preparedness, and determination. And even if other threats arose in the future, Redstone was prepared. Because no matter who came in challenging Ray Carter and his city, they would learn the hardest lesson of all. You don't mess with a community that stands united. And night fell quietly over Redstone. With night covering Redstone like a blanket of tranquility, the Iron Haven workshop remained silent. But it was a different silence this time. It was no longer the tense silence of those expecting the worst, but rather the stillness of a hard-won victory. Inside, Ray Carter sat in the old wooden chair beside the workbench, staring at the disassembled engine he had been working on before it all began. He picked up a screwdriver and turned a screw, almost automatically. The metallic sound echoed softly through the empty workshop. Jack appeared in the doorway with a slight smile. "You can't sit still, can you?" Ray chuckled softly, still focused on the engine. "Hands that'll still get rusty. Besides, it's good to get back into the swing of things. We've had enough action for a while now." Jack walked in and leaned against the counter, watching Ray work for a few moments. "You know, I've learned a lot from you, Ray. More than just how to fix engines. I've seen what it means to be strong, what it means to be resilient. And most of all, I've seen what it means to lead without having to shout orders. You've inspired this entire city." Ray stopped spinning the tool and looked at Jack with a proud smile. "It wasn't me, Jack. They just needed to remember who they are. And so did you. You found your strength. And it's always been there. Now you're not just an apprentice. You're one of them." Jack smiled. But before he could respond, the sound of tires on gravel outside caught both of their attention. Ray and Jack exchanged a glance and walked to the garage door. When they opened it, they saw an old semi-truck slowly approaching. It was one of Iron Haven's longtime customers, a driver named Frank, who often brought his vehicle in for service. He got out with a friendly smile. "I hope you guys are still accepting work," Frank said with a wave. Ray crossed his arms and smiled back. "Always." "What was it this time, Frank? The carburetor or the brakes?" Frank shrugged with a tired look. "The usual. Long road, heavy load. Old thunder. Here needs some TLC." Jack was already picking up his tools, excited to finally get back into the swing of things. "Well, let's take a look." Ray took one last look at the road in the distance, where danger had arisen so many times. Now, everything was calm. The dust from the road dissipated in the wind, and the city breathed in peace. As the next day began, Redstone was resuming his normal pace. Stores opened their doors, trucks crossed the highway, and residents continued their lives with the certainty that they were no longer an easy target. Beth reopened her cafe and smiled when she saw the familiar faces occupying the tables. Davidson, Harris, and the other veterans came in and sat down, ordering coffee like they did before it all started. Sheriff Grant drove by in his patrol. Carr stopped in front of the cafe and waved to the patrons, receiving waves in return. There was something in the sheriff's eyes that showed more than relief. It showed confidence. That same night, as Ray and Jack closed up the shop after a day of work, Jack looked up at the starry sky and sighed. It's strange. Everything seems so normal now. It's almost as if none of that ever happened. Ray stopped, looked up at the stars, and nodded. That's how it should be. Living in peace doesn't mean forgetting what we've been through, but learning to value every peaceful moment we've achieved. Jack smiled. Do you think that if something like this happens again, the city will be ready? Ray gave a light laugh. They won't just be ready, Jack. They'll know exactly how to cope, because now they understand something they should never forget. Strength isn't just who you are, but who's there for you when the going gets tough. Jack nodded, absorbing Ray's words as he locked the last door. And whoever is by our side knows they are in good hands. Ray Carter patted Jack on the back and walked over to his old parked Jeep. "That's it, kid. Now go get some rest. We have more engines to fix tomorrow." Jack laughed and waved, before heading towards his house. Ray got into his Jeep and started the engine. As he drove down the empty road toward his small house on the outskirts of town, he felt at peace. The fight was over, but he knew that if another storm came, he wouldn't be facing it alone. In the distance, the lights of Redstone shone like a beacon, a reminder that even in the midst of chaos, there was always hope. And so, with the soft roar of the engine and the sound of the wind in the trees, Ray Carter returned home. More than just a veteran mechanic, he was now the guardian of a city that had chosen to fight and had won. End.